Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Peter McEwen, an ordained Nyingma yogi, meditation coach, and founder of an organization called The Field, where he teaches tantric methods to practitioners navigating contemporary life demands. Since 1993, he studied under Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, Tulku Orgyen P'huntsok, Lama Pema Dorje Rinpoche, and Bruce Tift, and has completed the traditional 3-year Vajrayana retreat curriculum. Peter writes The Current on Substack, sharing essays and tools from 30 years of integrating contemplative practice with daily life. His work focuses on embodied presence and nervous system fluency, offering methods that survive the actual pressures of work, relationships, and daily complexity. Grounded in 3 decades of traditional training, Peter brings Vajrayana into direct conversation with the realities of modern life. In this episode, we speak about Peter's initial experiences of awakening, spiritual versus personal and interpersonal work, Tantra, Tummo yoga, Deity yoga, and how to get the most out of practice as a householder. Enjoy. Peter McEwen, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd love to set a little bit of context before we dive in. I think I first came across your name through a course you were teaching with Michael Taft. And I also seen some of your posts in the Evolving Ground community. So you're also part of that community. And since then, I've been hearing your name echoing in Dharma circles. And I've been eyeing your course on Tummo and Deity yoga, which look very interesting and like unique offerings. And I've actually signed up for your upcoming Tummo course, which I'm really excited about. And I've also enjoyed several of your essays on Substack.
Glad you're enjoying.
Yeah, so that's just kind of setting a little bit of context. And I'd love to dive deeper into different tantric methods that you teach. But it might be helpful, particularly for those who are new to you, to hear a little bit about your background and some of the significant turning points that brought you to meditation and the work you're doing today.
Sure. So I was a very anxious child. I'm from an indigenous background. I'm white appearing. I'm half white. I was raised in an indigenous household of anywhere from 8 to 10 people at any given time, raised by my grandparents. And so I was an altar boy as a child, and so grew up thinking about religion in general. My grandmother had a anomalous experience when she was 13 and had a vision of Christ. So I knew these things were possible, but I was quite an anxious child, and I was a national merit scholar, but I was growing up around people where intellectual and cerebral functionality was not like a priority. Survival was a priority. So I think once I started getting recruited by universities when I was 16 or 17, I didn't have a lot of intellectual support in the household, and I started developing really severe panic issues, which continued into my early 20s. When I finally, something in me just collapsed, basically. I think maybe from the strain, or it's impossible to know why, but I started having dramatic and potent experiences of the collapse of being a significant solid self, basically, and seeing that the levers that were being pulled by my psyche in order to stabilize who I was, what I was doing, where I was located, was just creating enormous amount of tension in my body and my mind. And then when that sort of all collapsed, everything was beautiful and functional and perfect. And I saw that a lot of the suffering I had been experiencing was a defense against open experiencing. And when that awakening sequence started rolling forward. It happened a number of times. It was actually hard to gain traction back with being a personality located at a certain college with bills to pay and all this other kind of stuff. So I was under the impression that Buddhism might help me. At this point, I had not been introduced to Buddhist practice or anything, but what I was looking for was a linguistic framework and a method that would help me stabilize these very dramatic experiences that were happening of just total openness and union with everything, basically. So I chose Buddhism. I was kind of exposing myself to Hindu methodologies, Father Thomas Keating, so some Catholic methodologies also, centering prayer and things like that. But Buddhism seemed to stick. And I also saw that Buddhists, lamas like the Dalai Lama, were working with scientists to kind of create some sort of coherent lexicon so there could be a communication between the more path-oriented methods of scientific materialism and then the more fruitional methods of Buddhist Dharma. And so I just started getting very interested in Vajrayana Buddhism and started practicing with a few different teachers, people like Lama Tarchen, Tulku Rinpoche, Tulku Orgyen, Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, Lama Pema Dorje are basically the group of my root teachers. So that's how it all started. This all happened in 1992 through 1995, this sequence of awakenings. And so I started practicing in earnest around that time. So about 30 years ago. I'm 52.
Yeah, this is very fascinating, like your story and like the way it happened. I mean, it just seems a little bit different. Like it seems like you were having kind of all this stress and anxiety. And then through that stress, there was like a collapse of the self and like this awakening, maybe no self experience. And only then it's like you pursue Buddhism as a way to kind of stabilize. And it seems like stabilizing, like figuring out like how do I have a healthy self, or how do I have a self that functions? Because now I'm in this place where it's just pure openness. So that's really interesting that you've had kind of all these awakenings before you actually started practicing.
Yeah, and I think exposure to referencelessness at that age, I think was a function of just an array of historical issues, like just growing up around whomever I was growing up around. And there's various levels of self-absorption all children are exposed to. Everyone's just doing their best. And I think especially children who don't grow up maybe with the middle class, white collar fantasy of a life without disturbance. We didn't have that in my household. I think there was just generational trauma and there's all kinds of abuse issues happening in that household. So I never had like a personality template that would probably have helped me develop a more stable sense of continuity as like a healthful personality. And that worked to my benefit ultimately. And I think a lot of people who have whatever kind of trauma, like they say, it's the light comes in through the crack in the eggshell, you know what I mean? And so the work after that was not only stabilizing the experiences, but actually having a more robust, more healthful sense of self. So doing Dharma practice in balance with Western therapeutic modalities was really helpful. And that's why I tend to weight the teaching I provide with, have a healthful sense of self, have, some secure attachment orientation. So when you do have open experiencing, it doesn't just completely leave you a wreck, or you don't turn into some evangelical internet personality claiming that everyone else needs to do what you're doing in order to attain something, right? So we want to do the work, personal work, interpersonal work, and spiritual work in balance, never really taking a side with being well-regulated before we do spiritual work, nor being enlightened before we decide to address whatever cleaning up we have to do, growing up, shadow work, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So are you saying that there isn't like a preferred sequence of how to do that? I mean, it does seem like for you, you had like you didn't have a really strong self. Like you said, you didn't grow up in an environment that kind of provided that stable, strong self. And maybe that made you kind of more sensitive to stresses and certain things and allowed that to kind of collapse, where for somebody else, they have maybe a stronger, maybe a more rigid self. And, you know, like they get teachings and it takes a long time for the teachings to penetrate. But then, you know, there is this notion of like, it is important to have a healthy self, especially like you can have this kind of spiritual experience and it can become really problematic, like not being able to find any stability or being able to function.
Yeah, it wasn't, yeah. I almost got defensive there. I wasn't completely dysfunctional, but maybe I was. I'm sure a lot of people in my early 20s thought I was. But I always think of it as, you know, fruit ripening and falling from a tree. There's all these causes and conditions, and sometimes maybe the fruit fell a little too early, or maybe it lingers too long on the tree. But there's all, you know, weather, the tree's genetics, whatever wildlife is around, all these kind of things are contributing to the ripening of a practitioner. I think specifically in the students I work with, primarily, a lot of them tend to be very philosophical and cerebral, and it's very easy to substitute concept for immediate experience in that realm. So yes, with that type of personality, I may encourage them to do more practice and less reading. In my case, that's how I was as a child. I think I used concept and philosophy as a defense from open experiencing. So I felt oriented and I knew what was going on. But when that finally cracks, you come to this conclusion, probably in the tantric realm at least, that, oh, that was like a helpful approximation to this. And it's so easy to take that approximation as having real material one-to-one relationship to what reality is or isn't. But is there a sequence that's ideal? I don't think so, because I think fruitional perspective, or like total open experiencing, and then relative perspective of like healthful self-care, healthful interpersonal relating, secure attachment, things like that. Those are just ways of looking at the world. They have no essential nature, right? And so my idea or my notion of non-duality is that we don't take a side with either of those standpoints or perspectives. We're always just in free fall. So if it happens too early to a practitioner, which I think happens frequently in the East, and there's not safety measures or safety nets there to help that person become better in their interpersonal or personal work, we get this kind of like guru abuse syndrome, right? Someone may have awakened to qualityless experience, and then they're enforcing that formula on the very messy, distracting, active world of appearances or phenomena, and it just doesn't work very well. And because the people on the side of the phenomena, they're still taking the world as if it has some sort of like essential nature or something. So it's very harmful to them if you're behaving in a way where you're coming from, oh, nothing matters, everything's just open interplay of energetic spiritual forces. That's like very damaging to communities, and I don't think it's not a very effective in the West teaching methodology. And then alternatively, like we were discussing, if you're too oriented or fixated on relative experience, then accessing open states might be more challenging.
Yeah, it's like on one side, there's like the going too much into reification, and the other side is like kind of just denying, like nihilism. And it's like, it seems like it's that kind of maybe that's like the middle way is between those two poles of reifying and just denying.
Yeah, I mean, we're only present in the present moment. We can only attend to what's here now. And I think using the tools at our disposal, whether those are therapeutic tools, physiological tools, breath work, trauma-informed work, or maybe we need to release our grip a little bit and just have more of a open Dzogchen style meditation practice to work with what's coming up, because we are feeling overwhelmed, or we are feeling that we're unconsciously trying to render the ineffable material. So I think that's the task that interests me in the modern practitioner, is you have a multitude of tools at your disposal. It can help to have some guidance on an assessment of your characterological style, whether that's through a therapist or a meditation coach, and then sort of acclimating and working, never fully landing, never fully trying to resolve those methodologies into a formula. I think that's going to work better, because then you're always in free fall. You're never kind of foisting this formula on reality, which can then maybe you might get a wrathful rebuke from reality if you try to impose a formula on this very active, dynamic system. And I think that happens to practitioners somewhat frequently, and that's the hard way of learning. And I think that's something Tantra excels with, is that the practitioner is never really allowed or encouraged to just take it easy. Oh, everything's just the display of Dharmakaya, or, oh, it's just the Dakini's warm breath. I mean, you can say that kind of stuff, but it's kind of cringy. It's kind of off-putting to a teacher when people talk that way, because you're just repeating a formula you read in a book. I'd rather hear about the dynamic interplay of your partnership, or how hard it is to raise your children. Or, to me, that's like the marrow of the practices we're doing, is like staying awake in these arenas and scenarios where it'd be so much easier to just go into a dissociative state and use whatever medicines or exercise or meditation to just support dissociation and bypassing. So just never quite being comfortable is a weird spiritual ethos to me.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it too, like as, there's this sense of knowing yourself and knowing all of reality as like divinity, and then also still remembering that you're human and like connecting to that. And it's like there could be this, this leaning into transcendence, and it's like, oh, I'm God and everything is God, and it's this kind of like just bypassing. Or there could be this, when there isn't that sense of transcendence or connecting to what is sacred, you just cannot, that could be depression too. You can fall into depression. It's like, I'm human, I'm limited, I had all these you go into all these stories about how hard it is to be a human. So it's like these two sides of the same coin, kind of, and just playing with them.
I think that's reflected in masculine and feminine neurotic styles. I saw you had Bruce Tift on, and I'm a huge proponent. He's a mentor of mine. He was my first and only therapist. But yeah, these neurotic styles, and I think which maybe loosely correspond to attachment theory, although Bruce doesn't try to create a synthesis with spirituality. I think he thinks of spiritual or fruitional practice and relative practice as discrete with their own helpful integrity. But yeah, you can see it in ourselves, like the way we dissociate, whether that's through, like if you have a masculine style, your meditation practice may feel brittle or arid, right? Lacking heart. maybe lacking embodiment sometimes. And then similarly for the feminine neurotic style, it may be too overly identified with community, too overly identified with identity, too overly identified with service, also known as, like ending up maybe being victimized by people with a perpetrator style. So we want to be not careful of those things because there's nothing wrong with those styles. They're just probably not serving our path of awakening if that's what we're doing. Because ultimately, all these formulas, strategies, dialogues, books we read, they're useful ways of working with a world that has no sort of center to it, right? And it's sort of teaching us not to take a side with a specific style or a specific identity. And they're all pointing towards this sense of still having a subtle sense of a central self, right? And I think that's where a coach or like a good friend or a partner, they're going to draw out any unconscious patterns that are still trying to hide out sort of and being a significant and solid self. Because the goal, if the goal is enlightenment, that can't be constructed, that can't be manufactured through practice. It's just going to happen, just like that ripening fruit. Someday the fruit will fall from the tree. And similarly, in many practitioners, the sense of being a self will just collapse. And that's sort of, and then there's just awareness of the present moment. Which doesn't mean we can't use these strategies to improve our experience, specifically the experience of the poor people who have to deal with us after awakening. But we can't manufacture enlightenment. But we shouldn't, I don't think, if you're enlightened, why not continue to do personal work? Why not continue to improve the display of your experiencing and make it easier on the people around you? There should be no aggression even to continuing to do meditation practice, interpersonal work, things like that after enlightenment. You just won't think it's about you. It's no longer about your self-worth or your intrinsic value. It's just arising and dissolving in immediate experience, which I'm getting at here is sort of like, we keep talking about, fruitional and relative experience, but they're all just sort of proxies for this greater enlightenment that I think most of us are actually aiming towards.
Yeah. You were mentioning a thing about practice getting dry or arid. That's definitely, I want to come back to that notion of devotion. And it's interesting you brought up Bruce Tift, because like right before you said that, I wanted to ask that and bring him in, because like a lot of what you say, it like reminds me of like what Bruce would say and what he talks about, fruitional and what's the other one? Developmental, he calls it, I think, fruitional and developmental. And it's interesting that he was your therapist. I can imagine that was a profound experience. Like I had him on my podcast and he definitely pulled a chair under me at one point. So I can imagine that, there's a lot of like therapists that are kind of just listen and don't say anything. I imagine he was not one of those. It's probably like just cut right through.
Yeah, I think for me, he helped me put the pieces together again after the I think awakening for anyone it's catastrophic. The old structures, they just can no longer return to their previous perceived strength. Once the container is broken, you can glue it back together, but every time you look at it, you'll see, that container was fragile enough that it broke and there's still a piece missing, basically. And I think, I think of him as someone who he's part of Trungpa Rinpoche's Sangha.
Yeah.
And if there's any exemplar of how tantric methods impact Western psyches, he was front row and center to that transformational community. And I live in Boulder, so the bits and pieces are still kind of laying around on the floor here after Trungpa Rinpoche kind of blew shit up and left. But that's why, again, I encourage my students or anyone who works with me to also work with a therapist or a coach or someone to help them get their interpersonal and personal strategies into alignment with their intentions. Enlightenment can't be aggressively chased or hunted. The more you hunt for it, the more you're just activating the seeking mind. And I think of ego as its functional nature is to seek better circumstances and be aggressive towards those circumstances it doesn't want. So it's good to be vigilant about that pattern, in my opinion.
Yeah, so many profound teachers you've had experience of working. It's just, I was just thinking about that, and it's beautiful. And yeah, it's beautiful that we get, these transmissions. And yeah, I wanted to ask you maybe a more broad question before we kind of dive into like Deity yoga and Tummo. And, that's the question of what is Tantra? And from my understanding, the heart of tantric practices is about bringing the messiness of human life onto the spiritual path. So, very much kind of talking about, the fruitional, developmental, like, bringing those together in some way, maybe. But whereas a sutric approach like emphasizes renouncing certain aspects of life, the tantric approach is about embracing and transforming them. And, my understanding is that Tantra also extends beyond Buddhism. You have something like Tantra Shaivism. And with that said, how do you understand Tantra? How do you see it relating to Vajrayana? Sometimes those terms seem synonymous to me also.
Well, Tantra in Tibetan is Jut, which means stream or flow. So it's transmission based. And to me, the way it's transmitted or way it flows from sentient being to sentient being is its reason to be. You know what I mean? Where you have these earlier methodologies, which are also orally transmitted, but oftentimes they're textually transmitted. And there's a lot of rules. There doesn't seem to be a lot of trust in human nature and the sutric meditations and sutric philosophies. And many of them tend to be quite cerebral, in the Madhyamaka specifically. So the tantric path has this sense of a descent, I think. Basically, okay, you've had awakening, but don't you long for the path that you just tread to get here? I think there's this longing, there's this sadness in a tantric practitioner of wanting to descend back into the valley you just ascended from. And basically, Ken Wilber positions it like there's eros and agape. So eros has this more upward, passionate, erotic force, and then agape has this unconditional inclusivity to it. And so I think of Tantra as being this unconditional, inclusive method or attitude of curiosity, especially in the political or cultural sphere, of acceptance of people who have a different point of view than you may have, or people who are breaking societal norms and encouraging them and embracing them within wisdom. In Buddhist Tantra specifically, butchers, prostitutes, basically any unsavory tathirkas, people who disagree with Buddhist methods and philosophies, those people are regarded as having the same potential anyone else does of becoming awakened, and in fact, in some cases, having even more potential to be what would be called like a tsunami of enlightenment, where they emanate not only enlightenment, they emanate whole legions of emanations of enlightenment to help sentient beings because they don't have hangups. They're not a prisoner of societal mores and things like that. So really what it comes down to for me is just having more curiosity about what is happening in my immediate experience. What is happening in my immediate experience that justifies or supports harmful behavior or justifies or supports aggression towards reality as it is? Isn't reality as it is perfect unto itself? Is it not worthy of acceptance and love? I think of Tantra in that sense. And then, of course, we have, as I was saying, we have this transmission lineage. And so you get like prescriptive methods from your teacher, and then they get turned into ideological movements. But I think a lot of that ideological or philosophical rubric that comes out of Tantra is sort of like a well-meaning effort to preserve a teaching. But I think the most important teaching is from teacher to student, or from practitioner to practitioner, basically. And so I think we always want to wait. Like Jerry Garcia says with the Grateful Dead, he's like, I play for warm living bodies. And I think that's what Tantra is all about, is the warm living body, not only our own embodied experiencing, but the other practitioners and who practice with us. And that should take precedence over any philosophical framework, basically. Because philosophical frameworks will eventually, the cultural habit that overtakes the actual method usually tends to calcify the habit, and it becomes more brittle, or the method. And that's why I'm very interested in Tummo and deity yoga, because I do think there's very valid, of course, like extremely valid methods there, but sometimes they get so obscured by the cultural habit and the cultural movements that they originate from that people can get more fascinated by the cultural habit of the deity and less about their immediate impression or experience of being the deity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually thinking something the opposite. Like, some people.
I accept that.
Yeah, that's the whole point of Tantra. But I was just thinking about how, a lot of what you were saying, it resonates a lot with me. And I feel like it would resonate with a lot of people. And sometimes people see something like Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana, and they actually like, what is that? You know what I'm saying? Like, how does that fit in with me? But like when you talk about Tantra and like, you wrote a couple of things that I wrote down, and like Tantra is the art and play of curiosity, or Tantra is full immersion and aliveness, or Tantra means recognizing the sacredness of all experience. I think like these kind of things would resonate with a lot of people, but yet like the cultural baggage and some of the stuff that people, they don't even know what like I didn't even know what Vajrayana was. Like I remember like, going through more Theravada and like kind of just like this pragmatic Dharma, and like I saw Evolving Ground as like this community for Vajrayana practitioners. And I'm like I didn't even know what Vajrayana was, you know what I'm saying? So it took me like a while to even like warm up to that. And now it's like this resonates so much. Like, the other piece that you were mentioning about like philosophical and intellectual stuff. And I feel like I'm that kind of person. Like I'm really into like philosophical, intellectual stuff. And, I've read so many books and so much stuff, and there's just something that feels so limited about that, which is very different than, let's say like immediate relational experience, like just interacting with somebody, and like allowing them to change you and being able to change them, impacting and being impacted by, that's very different. So like I've been thinking of like how, like what role does the intellectual and the philosophical play? Like what role does meta theory and some of that stuff play, and how does that integrate with this kind of practice and immediacy and Tantra?
I think of Tantra as sort of improvisational music. And so in order to improv effectively with other musicians, you have to understand the basics of chord structure, harmonics, orchestration, composition. So I do think it's very valuable to have some philosophical background in meditation practice, ethical practice, contemplations of all types. Buddhism is sort of like good at the beginning and good at the end. You know what I mean? I don't think we need to be aggressive towards any specific component or method. I think all methods are to be respected, but they, in my opinion, they do have they operate in a nested hierarchy. They build on each other. And so if you're doing something very granular like shamatha or insight meditation, it can become brittle. Like shamatha meditators, when you're just starting, you're so paranoid of thoughts coming. And then we begin to make it about ourselves. It's very subtle. It's sort of like, oh, the thoughts are coming, and then I'm getting absorbed in them, and then I'm behaving. And then, you'll have, the 12 nidanas are, they're active in my life. I'm a samsaric being, blah, blah, blah. And then you come up with this whole mental narrative about XYZ, which I think could be helpful as a mapping. But after you'll reach a certain point where that practice has become brittle. And then your teacher will say, okay, I think this student has probably like mastered that practice. I'm going to give them something from a broader basis, or something that transcends and includes that practice. So if they need to use that practice as a support, they can revert back to that, but something that's going to challenge their, not only neurologically, but emotionally. It's going to challenge you emotionally, neurologically, interpersonally to do the next practice. And so we always have these fallbacks, which are the methods. And so we use those supports when we're not capable yet of spontaneously staying awake under any circumstance and having a good state of mind regardless of circumstance, which is the goal. So I see these methods as like a cascading array of supports as one traverses the path towards the collapse of having a sense of a separate self, or actually investing in being a separate self. So I think what you're kind of touching on is, Buddhism has this natural inclination towards accommodating, nourishing, supporting developmental stages in practice and giving you the appropriate practice for your developmental stage. So if you're a 17-year-old and you shave your head and you don't yet have a whole lot of control over your testosterone and hormones, maybe it's better for you to not look at women and eat once a day and do a lot of shamatha and vipassana meditation. That might be wise. But when you're a little more mature as a practitioner, that container may be kind of hindering your growth into more and more inclusive stages of experiencing. So we use the tantric methods as sort of broadening the scope of our ability to tolerate and be kind towards existential intensity.
Yeah, the way I'm hearing this also is like, it's like scaffolding or like rafts or something. Yeah,
it's a skillful means. And I think it's really helpful to know philosophical or philosophy in general, and then also a range of methods, because it helps you help others on their path. So you should have all these kind of tools, just like a musician who's a great improviser has all kinds of ways, not only to like list, they can play listen to what the other players are doing, augment and support what the other player is doing, take the lead when it's appropriate, and basically become this responsive molecule in this musical organism, right? Which by its nature means the sense of self has dropped, because you're kind of like organizing your experience based on interdependent exchange. And I think similarly, Dharma practices, when you get really good at knowing when to do deity yoga, when to do completion practice, Tummo, or the 6 yogas, and when is it appropriate to just let it all flop and do Dzogchen types of methods, that's good for a practitioner to know. Now, if a practitioner is very young in their experience and their development, Dzogchen's not going to be the best way to do practice. If you can't concentrate, or you have not had much insight, or maybe you're very weak as in your interpersonal development or personal development, I wouldn't recommend Dzogchen. And I think that's part of the issue with the spiritual marketplace, is that there's no one there to help the practitioner get a sense of like which practice is appropriate for you, and to help them recognize, just because this practice has like a broader range of open experiencing doesn't mean that's going to be beneficial for a practitioner who isn't ready for that yet. Just like walking on stage with Miles Davis and you don't know how to play your instrument yet, it's going to not be a great experience. And in fact, it may be such a bad experience, you may want to give up music altogether. So that's the big fear with Dharma teachers and Tantra specifically, is that if a practitioner has access to a teaching or practice too earlier in their development, they may just give up the path completely, because it's so disappointing to have done that practice, especially with things like Dzogchen, which make very big promises, about siddhis, powers, open experience, luminosity, all these really big words. And if that's not happening, they may just go do something else. Maybe go do ayahuasca or something. Nothing wrong with that either, right?
That will get things going. Yeah, I feel like, there's nothing to grasp on or nothing to chew on. And then it's like, what am I doing here? We're so used to needing something to do. So it almost feels like as you progress, there's less and less of what there is to do.
I think what's often forgotten in spiritual circles is that ego process cannot join you in enlightenment. That would be like a wave experiencing the whole ocean. It's a nice idea. It reminds me of Tom Sawyer, where he gets to go to his own funeral. There's this real
have your cake and eat it too.
That we all have that secret wish of going to our own funeral, and ego process is obsessed with enlightenment because it thinks it's going to get to go to that funeral, but actually that funeral will be its death. It doesn't get to come. It doesn't get to enjoy that enlightenment. So anyway, just want to throw that out there.
I've heard the saying that you can't want this. That's what I've often heard. You can't want this.
Yeah, or it's ego's biggest disappointment.
Yeah. All right. Well, a lot of that is maybe we could get back to that whole notion of like, what is the proper order? That's really interesting too. And like, how all these practices fit together. But I actually wanted to, maybe we could dive into Tummo, because that's something I'm very interested in. That's also known as inner fire practice. And, as I mentioned before, I'm happy that I've signed up to both Module 1 and Module 2 of your upcoming Tummo course, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. In the Sangha I'm a part of, we actually have one member and practitioner. I know he's trained with you, and he recently started teaching some of the beginning practices. But other than that, I'm a complete beginner to Tummo. I've done Wim Hof breathing and like cold immersion practices for many years. But my understanding that Tummo is different. So it'd be great if you could kind of explain what Tummo is, how it works, and what role you see it playing on the path of awakening.
Well, based on my limited understanding, of course, Tummo and the 6 yogas has myriad formulations throughout the various lineages and microlineages of the Himalayan region. Tummo is most likely based on the early Hatha yoga of India. So it's not sort of a Tibetan product, although it has Tibetan interpolations. And it also has the advantage of practicing in very cold, dark places. And, just sweating and vitality is really helpful for people who are doing long retreats, who aren't bathing very frequently, who live in very cold, rugged conditions and aren't eating very much. So it's kind of known as being somewhat of a hardcore practice, primarily practiced in retreat situations and hermitage, exemplified by the great Tibetan saint Milarepa, who considered it, to be sort of like the ultimate practice and the quickest path to Mahamudra experiencing, right? Or like total open referencelessness experiencing. So Tummo is the way I tend to frame it to modern practitioners in the West who don't live in a retreat situation, who have bills to pay, kids to drive to school in the morning, internet. A lot of my people I know can't even put their phone down half the time. So asking them to do a lot of really intensive retreat practice is not going to work out very well. So I tend to frame it as sort of, okay, well, let's learn to tolerate existential intensity without falling into our dissociative habitual behaviors or narratives. So working with real somatic intensity without flopping into, oh my God, this is just open enlightenment, or oh my God, I'm becoming some sort of master of time and space, and I'm going to have all these powerful abilities to have like great sex, a perfect immune system, and perfect sleep, right? So we tend to kind of like go back and forth. And so when we're doing the Tummo meditation, we're actually trying to trap the prana. And in Tibetan philosophy, the prana is the wind, and the mind rides the wind. So naturally, we want to trap or calm that wind so the mind is not so erratically grasping and fixating on subject and object. So doing certain physical holds and breath holds, we sort of trap the prana or the mind in the central channel, the Uma Avaduti, also known as. When you do that practice and you get competent at it, the sense of self drops because there's no longer subject or object, which are created by the errant activity or over arousal or excitatory potential of the winds, right? So just when I'm talking about this, it kind of proves out we're taking normal experience and we're relanguaging it to make it easier for us to practice sort of hands-on, so to speak, with the mind. So if the mind's riding the wind, it kind of gives you all kinds of poetic, intellectual, and somatic ways of investigating this mind and how it's like moving through the body. Am I agitated? Is my head feel like tense at the crown? Do I have a knot in my stomach? Does my heart feel, hurt or tense? From the Tummo perspective, that's a function of how the winds are moving through the subtle body. And so these winds move through channels. So it's almost like it's a vascular system, so to speak, but it's for the wind or the prana. And then these channels coalesce into what we know as chakras. And then these chakras tend to be the location of concentrations of vital essence, also known as kundalini. So now we have this totally different model. Usually we would use words like arousal or restoration, but here instead we're using words like prana, vital essences, channels, and how can I manipulate these forces or these components of experience by using visualization, posture, and breath work, with the goal of recognizing that appearances, all this, and emptiness, that they actually have no inherent nature, are in union at all times. So you could say appearances, or this dynamic experiencing of being a human, messy creature on a planet, that display is an emergent quality of emptiness or of awareness. Not one, not two. And so we don't want to read about it. We want direct experience of that. And so if we have that as the primary formulation and motivation, then we also have byproducts. And those byproducts are bliss in the body. Some people, you could roughly say it's equivalent to piti or sukha, things like that, just from the intense concentration of having all the air in the central channel. And then purifying this whole channel system, because just like our muscular system, it gets all kinked up, and there's a lot of trauma held in the energetic patterns of the body. So we're looking to kind of smooth those channels, unblock those old traumas, and basically through that unblocking process, we awaken parts of the psyche and of the body that have been dormant. And those dormant parts often give rise to experiences of bliss, sometimes disturbance, sometimes has a sexual quality, sometimes it has incredible warmth. And that warmth is what it's kind of known for, right? It's known as sort of like, oh, wow, so these monks can raise their temperature, lower their metabolism significantly, and raise their immune system and things like that. And those are just byproducts from the essential focus, which is to recognize appearances and emptiness as being always in union, primordially.
Yeah, that's a fascinating overview. I'm very much...
just another method though,
Yeah. I'm very interested in, energy practices and like embodiment and nervous system work. And it sounds like this is all of that. And with like the view of, awakening, like kind of going to awakening and recognizing that and stabilizing that. Maybe right now is a good time to give a try with the Tummo. Do maybe
I can take us through a quick meditation. I'd be happy to. And I just wanted to quickly say, my friend Johnny Miller does some really great work in nervous system regulation. And there's a researcher whose name escapes me who talks a lot about latches. And Bruce also, any embodied person knows how it feels to clench in the body, right? And so when I was talking about these knots in the subtle body, that would be sort of the energetic knot it's sort of like a proto knot. And then later it renders materially in the musculature. And so I kind of feel like this inner technology hopefully will get translated into nervous system regulation work too, because I think unclogging sort of these energetic contractions at a more subtle level is going to have a more sustainable long-term benefit than just doing it at the muscular level, because it just seems like the way humans are built, the muscles just tend to go back into contraction pretty quickly. But if you can unloose energetically, it tends to have a longer tail. So just want to throw that out there for those of you who are interested in doing nervous system regulation.
Beautiful.
Okay, so let's have an intention of experiencing joyful mind, and then having this internal energetic pathway network. We want to experience that as quite awake instead of dormant or recoiling from our experience, recoiling from the fear that we'll re-experience a traumatic experience, right? We want to have blissful vital essences. And when we could roughly say these vital essences are like hormones, kind of a little bit. You could think of things like sexual bliss and sexual fluids even being sort of like a gross form of this vital essences, this like raw aliveness and functionality that courses through our blood and mind and our heart. So we establish a good intention to benefit the people around us, to have compassion for people who are walking around the earth in a state of zombie-like self-absorption, perhaps. People who are having a hard time making ends meet so they can do Dharma practice or to move their personal work forward because maybe they don't have enough time. We just want to, there's myriad reasons to have compassion for sentient beings, animals, algae, everything, because it's all an expression of our awakened nature. So we want to have love for that. And then we just sit up straight. We take a breath through and we're just going to breathe through our nose. So take a nice gentle inhale all the way down into the core and feel that raw aliveness in the core of the body. Gentle exhale. Then we're going to do a nice gentle inhale down into the tingling, awake, sparkling effervescence of the raw aliveness in our midsection. You can just feel that alive metabolism down there in our solar plexus. Then on this next inhale, we're going to want to inhale through the nose, very gently, slowly. And then we're going to want to put a little tension around our PC muscle, kind of like you're holding in, like you have to go to the bathroom, but you're holding it in. Just hold that for a couple seconds while holding your breath. Now a gentle exhale through the nose. And then in this next one, we're going to do a gentle inhale through the nose. And then we're going to do the same clenching, gentle clench of the PC muscle. And we're going to allow the diaphragm to kind of droop downwards. And if you want to apply a little pressure, you can go ahead and do that. So we're creating what's called a vase here. Bumpa. And just hold your breath and feel the arousing aliveness in the midsection of the body. And as this is happening, you're going to kind of tune in to any reactivity around holding your breath or wondering if you're doing it right. You know, you're going to have not only narratives, but you're going to have funny sensations. And go ahead and exhale. So inhale through the nose, starting now. Go ahead and tense the PC muscle. Allow the diaphragm to drop, creating a little vase, and just holding your breath very gently and working with whatever comes up, making space for stories, sensations, intensity. You're going to start feeling a little bit warmer in your body as you do this. And I want you to continue breathing like this. This is just called a gentle vase breath. This is a very simple version of it. You're doing the inhale through the nose. You're tensing the pelvic floor. Hold the breath, and then allow the diaphragm to drop down, or you could gently press it down and just see what comes up for you while I take you through the rest of this brief meditation. So the next time you inhale and you do this very gentle vase breathing, you're going to instantaneously become a crystalline bubble of white light. So now we have a few objects for which we can contemplate or meditate with, right? We have the pelvic floor tensing up, not allowing the air to so-called leak downward through our bottom. And we're matching that tension with our diaphragm. And in that vase, heat starts to build. And sometimes you'll feel this as like shakiness or tension. Just try to work with that and just be kind towards it, tolerate it, invite it, allow it to be. And then all of a sudden you burst into this clarified form of being a crystalline white light, almost like a star sparkling in the sky. So just continue breathing. And in this crystalline form, there's 3 basic channels, and they're like little flexible luminous tubes. The central channel extends from your secret place or your genital region to the crown of your head, like the stem of a wild flower, radiant, silky smooth, translucent, and flexible. Just keep doing the breathing. And it's okay if you can't see this clearly, just know that you are sort of this bubble of luminous perception. Just the fact that you're knowing the world around you from the Vajrayana point of view, that knowing is the luminosity. That is the light bulb in the projector, so to speak. So now we have 2 more channels to go through. The central channel has a bluish color, like the sky in the morning. The right channel is pink and reflects the solar substances in the body. The left channel is white and reflects the lunar substances in the body. So now we have this clarified crystalline bubble with a blue channel in the middle, red channel on the right, and the left, and the white channel on the left. And these channels are radiant like rainbows, silky smooth and flexible, and shiny as silk thread. And then from these channels burst other micro channels. They've always been there, but now you're noticing it. So your mind is just flowing through I liken it to a vascular system, but it's full of mind. So you kind of like are lit up like a tree in a big crystalline bubble with 3 main branches. So wherever our attention goes, that's where the prana goes. So now we're going to kind of let the attention ride on the winds of the prana, and we're going to travel up and down the central channel. All the while you're doing this very gentle base breathing. After a while, it will become quite automatic. So at your heart chakra, I just want you to imagine, for simplicity's sake, a little drop of white liquid and a drop of red liquid, about the size of a sesame seed. Just very beautiful, almost like oil shimmering in water. And enter into those drops. Allow yourself to feel spacious and open-hearted as you go into these rainbow-like liquid drops that are at your heart. And enjoy the blissful atmosphere of being in union with these drops, allowing your mind to relax into this rainbow. Now we're going to start looking upwards towards the throat, where we're going to see a 16-petaled flower. And just start to move your attention towards your throat. Glowing red, full of bliss and wisdom. Identifying and being in union with this area sweetens your speech, sweetens the words that come to mind, purifies negative thoughts. And then as you can kind of like look upward towards the crown of your head. And it's rainbow in color and extends in all directions. Traditionally known as having 32 branch channels. And from this vantage point, you can see the entirety of this luminous body you're inhabiting. You can look down through the central channel and see the throat and the heart, all the way down to the navel center, the source of our life, the source of this emanation we call this human existence. So go ahead and travel back down towards your throat, then back to the heart. Then we're going to go downwards into the navel center where we're holding this vase, where we're feeling this shaky aliveness. And we're feeling blocked channels opening, crooked channels straightening. As we move our attention through this system, our experience becomes more supple and flexible. Now just rest your mind in union with a little red flame, 4 finger widths below the navel center. And just like if you threw a piece of paper into this flame, go ahead and put your mind into this flame, and you will immolate in this blissful fire and become one with it. And just let everything drop. Continue the breath. Feel the refreshing pulse of bliss, tingling, and aliveness. Let it flow from your sacral area to the navel center a few times. And explore and acclimate in this confluence of subtle and physical sensation as it illuminates your experience. So take a couple more inhales through the nose. And now let's let a long exhale through the mouth. Letting any tension dissolve. One more inhale through the nose. And a very long exhale through the mouth. Hold your mouth like you're holding a straw. And then dedicate your practice towards your own well-being, the well-being of your loved ones, the well-being of your enemies, and that you someday become realized and are of total benefit to sentient beings, complete compassion. And that's sort of a general, very, very general sequence that we could use in Tummo. Of course, it's much more elaborate. And as you could probably tell, the longer you do that breathing pattern, the more warmth you'll generate in the solar plexus, which then becomes sort of its own object of meditation, pulling the prana, pulling the mind into the center of your body. So just like Zen people talk about the hara, here we're talking about the chandali or the atung, pulling our awareness into our own centeredness and becoming this object we can recognize as our own fundamental nature. And that matched with some yoga postures, it creates a really great environment to investigate our vulnerabilities, investigate patterns of reactivity, investigate this very pliable, tricky world of ego process and how it tends to substitute our experience with its presence. And, it's very seductive. We end up thinking we're ego process when we're actually just open experience. And so I think these investigations, are fulcrumatic and really helpful for certain types of practitioners.
Yeah, thanks. This was great. I feel a lot of heat in my belly, and I feel my body a lot more. Feel very grounded in the body. And I'm curious, how important is the visual aspect versus feeling? Because I kind of noticed there's some of my attention was just on feeling and the breath, and some of it was with like trying to follow the visualizations.
Yeah, I think that's an opportunity, right? I think that's an opportunity from the standpoint, because this is from the Anu Yoga tradition, or the completion stage practice, which is related directly to Dzogchen or Mahamudra, depending on the lineage. And so that is an opportunity for you or any practitioner to recognize that, okay, sensations came from nowhere, passed through my awareness and dissolved. Then the visualization came from nowhere. I recognized it and it spontaneously dissolved without any trace, just like writing our name in water. So we don't want to try to enforce sort of like this abiding kind of strategy that we have in Vipassana and Shamatha. We're just noticing these. In Dzogchen parlance, we're merely knowing the appearance of a sensation, of a perception, of a thought. And we're just letting everything unfold quite naturally. And for some practitioners, they'll emphasize more of the visualization. For a certain type of practitioner, they emphasize more of the sensation level experience. I think we want to trust our intuitive intelligence and work with what's arising instead of enforce this formula of doing it the right way. But that being said, like a musician, you want to play your scales. So we want to balance that fruitional perspective I just gave with the relative or developmental perspective of like, okay, during practice today, I'm going to emphasize the feeling state of being a crystalline, empty bubble. I'm no longer full of guts and blood and flesh. I'm just sort of this open, crystalline appearance. That's one way to do it. And then some days you get on the cushion and you're like, oh, I feel really like in my head lately. I want to feel like the blissful, almost sexualized warmth of the raw aliveness in my sacral and secret organ area. So I think that's Tantra, right? We rely on the practitioner's intuitive intelligence with gentle feedback from the coach or the instructor to just keep you from not turning it into just another spiritual formula. And we're just working with what's coming up for us and allowing it to increase in magnitude and accuracy through practice, not through imposition.
Beautiful. Yeah. So another practice that you've been teaching is Deity yoga. And this one, I'm even more of a beginner than Tummo. And like my basic understanding of Deity yoga is that it works on transforming the self-image through like intricate visualizations. I've read a bit about it, but I haven't really connected with it or engaged with it as a practice. So in a similar light to my Tummo question, what is Deity yoga? How does it work? What role do you see it playing in the path of awakening?
I think of it for my purposes. The purposes of an 8th century tantric practitioner might be different than what I think are useful for a modern practitioner. So I just want to offer that caveat. I'm just giving. But I would say for many tantric Vajrayana types, this is like the primary practice many of us do because it's the easiest. We were talking earlier about developmental stages we go through as a practitioner. It's the easiest to fall back in to because it mirrors our fixation on this confluence of thinking, perception, sensation that's constantly happening, and all these apparent identities that are coursing through our body mind. And this vivid array of appearances that are rendering all day long in our experience. So Deity yoga wants to leverage that and say, okay, well, you have sort of an ignorant view. You've been raised in whatever culture at whatever time by whatever parents who probably were not enlightened, and you have probably an inaccurate view of what reality is. We want to give you this practice to bring you closer to an accurate view of identity, how it renders appearances and your relationship to them, sensations, and whether or not you regard them as pleasurable or neurotic or disappointing or something to be aggressive towards. We're going to replace all that. And now you are the deity. You're a universal monarch. So all your sensations are perfectly engaged and proliferating as the bliss of being the Buddha. All appearances are the blissful renderings of this energetic, unknowable, geometric, perfect universe as it unfolds moment to moment. All thoughts and sounds are the mantra of the deity. So basically, at base, it's the practice of replacement. We replace neurotic experiencing with sane experiencing from the Tibetan Buddhist or Indian Buddhist conception of what is sane. The way I offer the practice tends to be more working with core vulnerabilities as a deity instead of as sort of like your conditioned sense of self. Because if you engage with a core wound or a core vulnerability as Green Tara or Padmasambhava or some other Avalokiteshvara, you might have a better experience and have more confidence working with that very disturbing sensation or narrative that you associate with that core wound. And then secondly, we recognize, okay, well, if the deity is not here and absolutely true, and I'm just imagining it, that means it's empty of inherent nature. And yet, when I visualize it, it's quite apparent and vivid. So that brings us to the conclusion that reality itself also has no essential reference point, but is vivid and constantly changing and dynamic. And so maybe the reality I'm experiencing similarly is the union of appearances and empty cognizance. I think Donald Hoffman actually has some really interesting theories about this, and how he talks about how the biological cognitive system that is threat averse is basically creating its own interface with, the unknowable energies at work, and we're just processing and interpreting. So similarly here, deity yoga could be regarded loosely as consonant with that notion of sort of like, okay, well, I know I'm not seeing the world accurately. When I see the world as the mandala of deities, I have a better experience, and then I'm having more experiences of open experience. So why not use that orientation? I'm less about what is right. I'm more about what is going to work for a practitioner. And I see deity yoga as a really great gateway, because you're also, I'm lauding this. I'm not trying to sell this. I'm just trying to I just think it's so great, because when you're doing deity yoga, you're doing the union of shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha holds the visualization still. Vipassana knows that the visualization is not totally true. So you're doing both at once. It's a really beautiful way to access samadhi or jhanic experiencing.
Yeah. So, the other question that I have is, it seems like there's these different deities, right? These kind of forms, these beautiful images, but it also seems like it's important to have a certain understanding of what they represent or what they mean, and have some kind of a relationship to them. And personally, once again, I haven't engaged a lot with this practice, but when I see these different images and stuff like that, it's like, okay, this is a cool image, but how do I relate to it? And I don't know if that's the notion of the Eastern and the Western thing, and growing up in Tibetan culture, and seeing these images and growing up with them. And then it's it becomes these kind of archetypical symbols that embodies these certain qualities. Maybe it's not the same for us. I heard you speak a little bit about this, of how maybe deities need to change for the West. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
I don't know if they need to change, but they certainly need. It's sort of like they're weird to Tibetans too. Tibetans don't see four-faced 16-armed creatures walking around either, right? So I think the problem a little bit for Westerners is, when you engage with the deity, every implement it appears with is a reference to the topology of the Buddhist philosophy that it was born from. And so if you did grow up in the East, you probably would recognize flaying knives and skull cups as being referencing something culturally. And so I don't think the appearance of the deity is inherently problematic. I just think that if we don't have precedent, the skull cup or the blood or the skull necklace, a lot of those things don't have any referent in our day-to-day experience. So I think re-languaging it is probably more accurate, to my opinion, because a lot of our identity complexes also are mysterious to us. We all have a self-sabotaging subpersonality, and since it hides in the shadow, we can't work with it directly. We work with it through the symptoms that arise when it feels unseen, unrecognized, not nurtured. we don't know how it looks. We don't know. We only know its results. So I think similarly here with the deities, you could elect a troublemaking deity and say, okay, this is the replacement for my self-sabotaging subpersonality, and work with it consciously. A lot of us have poverty consciousness. So if you want to render as a wealth deity, and it's almost works in parallel with how hypnosis works, it's like reconditioning your subconscious to probably build the neural wiring to just have a more wealthy narrative in your mind. So that to me is like a mundane example of like how we can use a deity to replace outdated patterns of self-concept and behavior. As for recreating the whole thing, I think that is the work of, artists, people like yourself. Someone's got to step into that. I think Jeffrey Kripal talks a lot about this in his study of superheroes, comics, UFOs, anomalous experience, and how they render as like a talking raccoon or some sort of cryptid or as a mantis-like creature. I think we as a culture need to find our own renderings of these deities, not because there's something wrong with deity yoga, but just because the renderings they don't have a cultural resonance for us. So I agree and disagree with myself all at once. That's sort of like my style. But a lot of the students who just went through the deity yoga cohort, I was giving them free rein to kind of, if you're arising as green Tara, don't worry that it looks like a Tonka painting. Just make it the best looking person you've ever seen. You're going to have a much better time meditating on the best looking person you've ever seen than some sort of like Tibetan fabrication. And so I think in that sense, that's a skillful means that we should be enacting as practitioners. I don't really know. It's such a tough question because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But I look to all of us as a community of practitioners to figure all this out, especially people who do IFS or ideal parent. Is doing deity yoga have the same mundane accomplishment, but does it have an upgrade to it of recognizing the union of emptiness and appearances? I think so. I think you can use IFS and deity yoga in consort and have a pretty interesting therapeutic and spiritual practice there.
Beautiful. Yeah. Sounds like this is kind of like the edge of your exploration.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for saying that, because I would never say that to myself. I don't really talk to myself very much, so I have a hard time explaining what I'm thinking a lot of the time.
Nice. So, something else that, you wrote about in your deity course, you sent me you so graciously shared your slides with me, and it was about the absolute commitment of some Tibetan masters, and then acknowledging our level of commitment given our responsibilities as householders. And this is something I think about a lot. Like, on the one hand, I feel like practice is the foundation of my life. And on the other hand, sometimes I feel like other things become a bigger priority and overshadow practice. And, I guess maybe some of this ties into the notion of personal drama or somehow needing to be better. Like, I'm not devoted enough, or, but I'm curious if you can say how we can manage having realistic expectations of what's possible as a householder. How do we relate to this question of motivation and devotion?
Well, doing a lot of practice, if we're using the metaphor of being a musician in an improvisational band, it's going to make you acclimate towards realization more elegantly, but it's not going to create realization, because there's plenty of people like myself who had awakenings with I was just sitting on a hill looking at the ocean. It wasn't like I was like meditating or something. I didn't know anything about meditation at that point in my development. And there's plenty of stories of this kind of thing just sort of happening to people, just like ripening fruit. But I do think that we want to practice ideally with our core vulnerabilities, because that's probably the symptoms of avoiding core vulnerabilities is what is distracting us from immediate open experiencing. So when I'm working with other practitioners, or I should speak for myself, when I'm working with myself, that's my primary goal, is to look at the areas where I'm neurotically organizing my life or avoiding things I don't want to feel, and then behaving compulsively in ways to avoid feeling specific ways. To me, that's going to take less of a time commitment than doing like a 3-year retreat, or I know a lot of people who've done 6-year retreat. That doesn't mean they ever touched those core vulnerabilities. They may just be excellent meditation practitioners. And, you can't turn a big chunk of rock into a polished tile, right? It's just, there's no need to, basically. I think a lot of these the practices make you a better practicer. They don't necessarily make you a realized being. And so a lot of the hardships that long-term practitioners go through, which are often extroverted as demons or obstacle makers, things like that, I see those demons or obstacle makers as ways we organize our experience now, today. So we can directly work with those vulnerable feelings or patterns of distraction without necessarily doing really elaborate ritual work. Because also that ritual work can become a distraction too. Being a Buddhist for many Buddhists, is probably the biggest distraction. They work so hard to become the best Buddhist that they're missing it all the time. That this is it. This is everything. This is timeless. And there's no one here. There's just this vivid display or appearance of there being Peterness and Artemness. This is everything. All we have to work with is now. So I don't think necessarily, especially as the world is changing in ways that has a magnitude never before seen, I think working with core vulnerabilities, surfacing out-of-date patterns of behavior and distraction, maybe in my mind take precedence over doing a 3-year retreat and becoming chakra sambhara. There's a great quote by Jamyang Choki Lodro about how sad he was to see all these practitioners in the late 19th, early 20th century rendering themselves as chakra sambhara around all this ugliness, right? We don't want to hide out in our spiritual practice. We want to be engaged as much as possible to our capacity without falling into, over-functioning, or we want to be regulated. We want to work at our edges. So I think in the older lineage masters, they were doing a lot of practice, but it was also because this is like an oral transmitted lineage. So you take someone like Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche or my own teacher, Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, they just quote books. They know whole books, whole philosophical tomes by memorized. So I think that doesn't make them more enlightened, but it helps them more helpful for other practitioners. So if that is your motivation, is to become really helpful for other practitioners as being like a source of knowledge and wisdom, yes. Doing a lot of retreat time, doing a lot of study, learning all the deities in the treasure teachings, things like that can be really helpful. But I think if you want to carry on this normative lifestyle, pay the bills on time, have time for pleasure with your partner and your family, see a movie now and then, and have a more watch your show now and then. I think you're going to have a different way of orienting around what practice is for you. And so that's why I personally try to turn my practices into like the distillation of the practice to accommodate the fact that most of us can't even put our phone down for long enough to do much practice. I myself just got my cell phone usage down to an hour and a half a day. That's fucking crazy that I spend that much time on my phone. And that took like 2 weeks to get to that level. And so if someone can't seem to put down their phone, turn that into your meditation practice. If you're looking at the phone, do the Dzogchen style of merely knowing and just being like, oh, I'm not going to get absorbed in the content of experience. I'm going to balance fundamental awake aware cognizance with this vivid display of whatever's rendering on the phone without getting absorbed in it and being distracted. I say turn everything into an opportunity to awaken to whether or not we're avoiding open, free fall of being a messy human being. And that includes things like, I think most importantly for many of us, that's physical intimacy and relational intimacy are the best two modalities from my perspective to investigate where do I start and where does the other begin? Why does this person trigger me so frequently and why am I so reactive to my partner or my colleagues' like habitual behaviors? Why are they so activating for me? What am I trying to avoid or where is there a projection happening? I think those are very worthy sources of inquiry and personal evolution. I don't necessarily think mastering all the deities in the Rinchen Terzo and doing the 6 yogas and then doing Tekchu and Tugal, I don't know if it's going to be better for Westerners. I just don't know. I think by integrating awake, aware cognizance into daily life, that is the practice. It's hard to turn that into a religion or into a reliable spiritual formula when you're just maintaining awareness, even when you don't want to feel what's actually happening in your experience. That's more direct from my perspective. I wish I had known that when I was younger. I would know a lot less about Buddhism. I think I thought I was going to Buddhist my way to some sort of conclusion or resolution, but it never worked out that way.
Yeah. It sounds like what you're saying is you don't have to be a Buddhist scholar. You don't necessarily have to do long retreats as long as you kind of lean into your vulnerabilities and kind of like feel into like the things you try to avoid or things you try to run away from or kind of the neurosis you have. If you can kind of discover what those things are and lean into them, maybe you get like more bang for your buck and maybe you can kind of live the life of a householder and still kind of have deep realizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing for a practitioner, in my view, is to clarify your goals and intentions. And then you can tailor the practice to meet those goals and intentions. Because ultimately, all you have is embodied engagement with this endless stream of experience that's happening now. When you're practicing, you'll be practicing now. When you're arguing with your partner, you're doing it in the now, like you're doing it in your present experience. So do the best you can with that. And usually that means not trying to escape disturbing experience. For modern Western practitioners, we're very good at pacifying ourselves. We're very unskilled at tolerating, inviting, and being kind towards disturbance. It's just not part of our culture. A bigger part of our culture is the dream of me and making it pleasant.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciated this conversation. I feel like we transversed a lot of territory, between the fruitional view, kind of leaned into some of the stuff Bruce talks about, fruitional and developmental, spoke about Tantra. Tummo, you guided us through a beautiful practice, spoke a little bit about Deity yoga and motivation, and just kind of bringing the practice into our daily life. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
I would just say, if you're listening to this, be kind towards yourself. You're trying to improve not only your experience, but the experience of those around you. And I think that's been really downplayed in the West in general. We're trying to awaken and realize our loving nature. And I think it's hard work. There's a lot of layers to peel away, but there's never any reason not to be generous towards yourself and those around you for just doing your best. And then lastly, anything that helpful I say is just a function of parroting unskillfully the amazing wisdom from people like Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, Lama Pema Dorje, Tulku Orgyen, and Bruce Tift, who are like my main teachers. Everything I have flows from those people. So I'm just eternally grateful. And if I've misrepresented any of Buddhism's ideas, I'll work with that core vulnerability.
Nice. Beautiful. Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure. It's nice to talk because, like I was saying, I don't often talk about what I think, strangely. I'm not a thinking person. I'm more of a perceiving person. So it's always challenging for me so thanks for bearing with me and asking such great questions. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And, I want to mention that I know your Tummo course is coming on. It's coming up. And actually, this will probably be released in like 2 weeks. So I think that will be a little bit before your course starts. I don't know if you have a day when the registration ends or
22nd, I think.
And that's the day it starts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the day it starts. And that's when, so I think some people will be able to hear this, and I'll put the links in the show notes if they want to sign up. And I know you're going to be teaching this stuff again. So hopefully if they don't get to come around this time, they'll get an opportunity to engage with it later down the line.
I even forgot to pitch anything. That's okay, though. I think I just can't believe how lucky I am that you had me on your show. That's thank you.
Thank you, brother. No, I feel lucky to be able to have you on my show and to be able to learn from you and to, just soak in that lineage, all these masters and people that you've engaged with. It's beautiful to be able to get a taste of that transmission.
That's so nice of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, brother. Appreciate you.
Bye.